Hello and welcome, fifth grade readers. We are reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling, and we are currently on chapter 5, which is Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. And we just left Harry Potter and the Weasleys jumping through Privet Drive's fireplace, and the Dursleys kind of lost their minds a little bit, and poor Dudley, I mean, if you couldn't call him poor, sympathize for him, just got a huge tongue, and Mr. Weasley was trying to help him, but kind of unsuccessfully because Aunt Petunia and Mr. Dursley were kind of losing their minds a little bit. So, we're going to find out what happens next. Harry spun faster and faster, elbows tucked tightly to his sides, blurred fireplaces flashing past him until he started to feel sick and closed his eyes. Then, when at last he could feel himself slowing down, he threw out his hands and brought himself to a halt in time to prevent himself from falling face forwards into the Weasleys' kitchen fire. "Did he eat it?" said Fred excitedly, holding up his hand to help Harry to his feet. "Yeah," said Harry, straightening up. "What was it?" "It was a tongue toffee," said Fred brightly. "George and I invented them. We've been looking for someone to test them on all summer." The tiny kitchen exploded with laughter. Harry looked around and saw Ron and George were sitting at the scrubbed wooden table with two red-haired people Harry had never seen before, though he knew immediately who they must be. Bill and Charlie, the eldest Weasley brothers. "How are you doing, Harry?" said the nearer of the two, grinning at him and holding out a large hand, which Harry shook, feeling calluses and blisters under his fingers. This had to be Charlie, who worked with dragons in Romania. Charlie was built like the twins, shorter and stockier than Percy and Ron, who were both long and lanky. He had a broad, good-natured face, which was weather-beaten and so freckly that he almost looked tanned. His arms were muscly, and one of them had a shiny burn on it. Bill got to his feet, smiling, and shook Harry's other hand. Bill came as something of a surprise. Harry knew that he had been working for the Wizarding Bank Gringotts, and that he'd been the head boy at Hogwarts, and he'd always imagined Bill to be an older version of Percy, fussy about rule-breaking and fond of bossing everyone around. However, Bill was, there was no other word for it, cool. He was tall, with long hair that was tied back in a ponytail, and he was wearing an earring with what looked like a fang dangling from it. His clothes would not have looked out of place at a rock concert, except that Harry recognized that his boots were made, not of leather, but of dragon hide. Before any of them could say anything else, there was a faint popping noise, and Mr. Weasley appeared out of thin air at George's shoulder. He was looking angrier than ever. "That wasn't funny, Fred," he shouted. "What on earth did you give that Muggle boy?" "I didn't give him anything," said Fred, with another evil grin. "I just dropped it." "You dropped it on purpose," roared Mr. Weasley. "You knew he'd eat it. You knew he was on a diet." "But how big did his tongue get?" George asked eagerly. "It was 4 foot long before his parents would let me shrink it." Harry and the Weasleys roared with laughter. "It isn't funny," Mr. Weasley shouted. "That sort of behavior seriously undermines wizard-muggle relations. I spent half my life campaigning against the mistreatment of muggles, and my own sons." "We didn't give it to him because he was a muggle," Fred said indignantly. "We gave it to him because he's a big bullying git," said George. "Isn't he, Harry?" "Yes, he is, Mr. Weasley," said Harry earnestly. "That's not the point," raged Mr. Weasley. "You wait until I tell your mother." "Tell me what?" said a voice behind them. Mrs. Weasley had just entered the kitchen. She was short, plump, and a woman with a very kind face, but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Oh, hello, Harry dear," she said, spotting him a smile. Then her eyes snapped back to her husband. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mr. Weasley hesitated. Harry could tell that however angry he was with Fred and George, he hadn't really intended to tell Miss Weasley what had happened. There was a silence, while Mr. Weasley eyed his wife nervously. Then two girls appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Mrs. Weasley. One with very bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth was Harry and Ron's friend Hermione Granger. The other two were small and red hair. The other one was small and red-haired and was Ron's younger sister, Ginny. Both of them smiled at Harry, who grinned back. which made Ginny go scarlet. She had been very taken with Harry ever since his first visit to the Burrow. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mrs. Weasley repeated in a dangerous, soft sort of voice. Oh, it's nothing, Molly," mumbled Mr. Weasley. "Fred and George but I've had a bit of words with them." "But what have they done this time?" said Mrs. Weasley. "If it's got anything to do with Weasley's wizarding wheezes, why don't you show Harry where he's sleeping, Ron?" said Hermione in the front doorway. "He knows where he's sleeping. In my room. He slept there last—" "We can all go," Hermione said pointedly. "Oh," said Ron, cottoning on. "Right." "We'll come too," said George. "We'll come too. Yeah, we'll come too," said George. "You stay where you are," snarled Mrs. Weasley. Harry and Ron edged out of the kitchen, and they, Hermione and Ginny, set off along the narrow hallway and up a rickety staircase that zigzagged through the house to the 2 upper stories. "What are Weasley's wizarding wheezes?" Harry asked as they climbed. Ron and Ginny both laughed, although Hermione didn't. "Mom found this stack of order forms when she was cleaning Fred and George's room," said Ron quietly. "Great long price lists for stuff that they invented. Joke stuff, you know. Fake wands and tricks and sweets. Loads of stuff. It was brilliant. I never knew they'd been inventing it all. We've been hearing explosions out of their rooms for ages, but we never thought they were actually making things," said Ginny. "We thought they just liked the noise. Only most of the stuff, well, all of it really, was a bit dangerous. And you know, they were planning to sell it at Hogwarts to make some money, and Mom went mad on them. Told them they weren't allowed to make any of it anymore, and she burnt all the order forms. She was furious at them. They didn't make as many owls as she'd expected. Owls were the ordinary wizarding levels, the examinations Hogwarts students took at the age of 15. And then there was this big row, Ginny said, because Mom wants them to go to the Ministry of Magic like Dad. And they all told her that all they wanted to do was open up a joke shop. Just then, a door on the second landing opened, and a face poked in wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a very annoyed expression. "Hi, Percy," said Harry. "Oh, hello, Harry," said Percy. "I was wondering who was making all the noise. I'm trying to work in here, you know. I've got a report to finish for the office, and it's rather difficult to concentrate when people are thundering up and down the stairs." "We weren't thundering," said Ron irritably. "We were walking. Sorry if we disturbed the top-secret workings of the Ministry of Magic." "What are you working on?" said Harry. "A report from the Department of International Magic Cooperation," said Percy smugly. "We're trying to standardize cauldron thickness. Some of these foreign imports are just a shade too thin. Leakages have been increasing at a rate of almost 3% a year." "That'll change the world, that report will," said Ron. "Front page of the Daily Prophet, I expect." "Cauldron leaks?" Percy went slightly pink. "You might sneer, Ron," he said heatedly, "but unless some sort of international law is imposed, we might find that the market is flooded with flimsy shadow-bottom products which seriously endanger—" Yeah, all right," said Ron, and he started up the stairs again. Percy slammed his bedroom door shut, and Harry, Hermione, and Ginny followed Ron up 3 more flights of stairs. Shouts from the kitchen below echoed up to them. It sounded as though Mr. Weasley had told Mrs. Weasley about the toffees. The room at the top of the house where Ron slept looked as much as it had done the last time Harry had come to stay. The same posters of Ron's favorite Quidditch team, the Chudley Cannons, were whirling and waving on the walls and sloping onto the ceiling. And the fish tank on the window sill, which had previously held Frogspawn, now contained an extremely large frog. Ron's rat, Scabbers, was here no more, but instead there was a tiny gray owl that he had delivered Ron's letter to Harry on Privet Drive. It was hopping up and down in the small cage and twittering madly. "Shut up, pig," said Ron, edging his way between the 2 of the 4 beds that had been squeezed into one room. "Fred and George are here with us because Bill and Charlie are in their room. Percy gets to keep his room all to himself because he's got work." Why are you calling that owl pig?" Harry asked Ron. "Because he's being stupid," said Ginny. Its proper name is Pigwidgeon." "Yeah, and that's not a stupid name at all," said Ron sarcastically. "Ginny named him," he explained to Harry. "She reckons it's sweet. And I tried to change it, but it was too late. He won't answer to anything else. So now he's Pig. I've got to keep him up here because he annoys Errol and Hermes. He annoys me too, come to that. Pidgewiggin zoomed happily around his cage, hooting shrilly. Harry knew Ron too well to take him seriously. He had moaned continually about his old rat Scabbers, but had been really upset, almost completely upset, when Harry's cat Crookshanks had appeared to have eaten him. "Where's Crookshanks?" Harry asked Hermione now. "Out in the garden, I expect. He likes chasing gnomes. He's never seen him before." "Percy's enjoying work, then?" said Harry, sitting down on one of the beds and watching the Chudley cannon zooming in and out of the posters on the ceiling. "Enjoying it?" said Ron darkly. "I don't reckon he'd come home if Dad didn't make him. He's obsessed. Just don't get him onto the subject of his boss. According to Mr. Crouch, as I was saying to Mr. Crouch is of the opinion, Mr. Crouch was telling me, they'll be announcing their engagement any day now." "Have you had a good summer, Harry?" said Hermione. "Did you get our food parcels and everything?" "Yeah, thanks a lot. They saved my life, those cakes." "And have you heard from—" Ron began, but a look from Hermione, he fell silent. Harry knew he'd been talking about Sirius. Ron and Hermione had been so deeply involved in helping Sirius escape from the Ministry of Magic that they were almost as concerned about Harry's godfather as he was. However, discussing him in front of Ginny was a bad idea. But nobody but themselves and Professor Dumbledore knew about Sirius, how he escaped or believed his innocence. "I think they've stopped arguing," said Hermione to cover the awkward moment, because Ginny was looking curiously from Ron to Harry. "Shall we go down and help your mom with dinner?" "Yeah, all right." The four of them left Ron's room and went back downstairs to find Mrs. Weasley alone in the kitchen, looking extremely bad-tempered. "We're eating out in the garden," she said when they came in. "There's just not enough room for 11 people in here. Can you take the plates outside, girls? Bill and Charlie are setting up the tables. Knives and forks, please, you two," she said to Ron and Harry, waving her wand a little more vigorously than she intended to, at a pile of potatoes in the sink, which shot right out of their skins so fast that they ricocheted off the walls and the ceilings. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped, now directing her wand at the dustpan, which she hopped off the side and started skating across the floor, scooping up the potatoes. "These two!" she burst out savagely, now putting pots and pans out of the cupboard. And Harry knew what she meant. She meant Fred and George. "I don't know what's going to happen to them. I really don't. No ambition unless you count making trouble as much as they possibly can." She slammed a large copper saucepan on the kitchen and began to wave her wand around inside of it. A creamy sauce poured from the wand tip as she stirred. "It's not as though they haven't got any brains," she continued irritably, taking the saucepan over to the stove and lighting it with a further poke of her wand. "But they're wasting them. And unless they pull themselves together soon, they'll be in real trouble. I've had more owls from Hogwarts than I have from the rest of my kids put together. If they carry on the way they're going, they'll end up in the improper use of magic office." Mrs. Weasley jabbed her wand at the cutlery drawer, which shot open. Harry and Ron both jumped out of the way as several knives soared out of it, flew across the kitchen, and began chopping the potatoes, which had just been tipped back into the sink by the dustpan. "I don't know where we went wrong with them," said Mrs. Weasley, putting her wand and starting to pull out more saucepans. "It's been the same for 4 years. One thing after another. And they won't listen to— Oh, not again." She picked up her wand, and it emitted a loud squeak and turned into a giant rubber mouse. "One of their fake wands again!" she shouted. How many times have I told those two not to leave them lying around?" She grabbed her real wand and turned to find the sauce on the stove was smoking. "Come on," Ron said hurriedly to Harry, seizing a handful of cutlery from the open drawer. "Let's go and help Bill and Charlie." They left Mrs. Weasley and headed out of the back door into the yard. They had gone only a few paces when Hermione's bandy-legged ginger cat, Crookshanks, came pelting out of the garden, Bottle Brushtail held high and chasing what looked like a muddy potato on legs. Harry recognized it instantly as a gnome. Barely 10 inches high, its horny little feet pattered very, very fast as it sprinted across the yard and dived headlong into one of the Wellington boots that lay scattered on the floor. Harry could hear the gnome giggling madly as Crookshanks inserted a paw into the boot, trying to reach it. Meanwhile, a very large crashing noise was coming from the other side of the house. The source of the commotion was revealed as they entered the garden and saw that Bill and Charlie both had their wands out and were making two battered old tables fly high above the lawn, smashing into each other, attempting to knock the others out of the air. And George and Fred were cheering loudly. Ginny was laughing, and Hermione was hovering near the hedge, apparently torn between amusement and anxiety. Bill's table caught Charlie with a huge bang and knocked one of his legs off. There was a clatter from overhead, and they all looked up to see Percy's head poking out of the window on the second floor. "Will you keep it down?" he bellowed. "Sorry, Perce," said Bill, grinning. "How are the cauldron bottoms coming on?" "Very badly," said Percy peevishly, and he slammed the window shut again. Chuckling, Bill and Charlie directed the table safely onto the grass, end to end, and then with a flick of his wand, Bill reattached the table leg and conjured tablecloths from nowhere. By 7 o'clock, the two tables were groaning under dishes and dishes of Mrs. Weasley's excellent cooking. And the 9 Weasleys, Harry and Hermione, were settling themselves down to eat beneath a clear, deep blue sky. To somebody who had been living on meals of increasingly stale cake all summer, this was paradise. And at first, Harry listened rather than talked, as he helped himself to chicken, ham, and pie, boiled potatoes, and salad. At the far end of the table, Percy was telling his father all about his report on cauldron bottoms. "I've told Mr. Crouch, and I'll have it ready by Tuesday," Percy was saying pompously. "That's a bit sooner than he expected, but I like to keep on top of things. I think he'll be grateful that I've done it in time. I mean, it's extremely busy in our apartment just now. What with all the arrangements for the World Cup, we're just not getting the support that we need from the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Ludo Bagman—" "I like Ludo Bagman," Mr. Weasley said mildly. "He was the one who got us such good tickets for the Cup. I did him a bit of a favor. His brother Otto got into a spot of trouble, a lawn-mower with unnatural powers. I smoothed the whole thing over." "Oh, Bagman's likable enough, of course," said Percy dismissively. But how he ever got the head of the department? When I compare him to Mr. Crouch, I can't see Mr. Crouch losing a member of our department and not trying to find out what's happening to them. You realize Bertha Jorkins has been missing for over a month now? Went on holiday to Albania and never came back?" "Yes, I was going to ask Mr. Ludo about that," said Mr. Weasley, frowning. "He says Bertha's got lost plenty of times before now, though I must say, if it was someone in my department, I'd be worried." "Oh, Bertha's hopeless, all right," said Percy. "I hear she'd been shunted from department to department for years. Much more trouble than she's worth. But all the same, Bagman ought to be trying to find her. Mr. Crouch has been taking plenty of personal interest. She worked in our department at one time, too. And I think Mr. Crouch was quite fond of her. But Mr. Bagman keeps laughing and saying she's probably misread the map and ended up in Australia instead of Albania. However," Percy heaved an impressive sigh, and took a deep swig of his elderflower wine, "we've got quite enough on our plates at the Department of International Magical Cooperation without trying to find one of the members of the department, too. As you know, we've got another big event to organize right after the World Cup." He cleared his throat significantly and looked down towards the end of the table where Harry, Ron, and Hermione were sitting. "You know the one I'm talking about, Father." He raised his voice slightly. "The top secret one." Ron rolled his eyes and muttered to Harry and Hermione, "He's been trying to get us to ask what the event is ever since he started work. Probably an exhibition of thick-bottomed cauldrons." In the middle of the table, Mrs. Weasley was arguing with Bill about his earring, which seemed to be a recent acquisition. "With a horrible great fang on it. Really, Bill? What do they say at the bank?" "Mom, no one cares how I dress at the bank as long as I bring home plenty of treasure," said Bill patiently. "And your hair's getting silly, dear," said Mrs. Weasley, fingering her wand lovingly. "I wish you'd let me give it a trim." "I like it," said Ginny, who was sitting beside Bill. "You're so old-fashioned, Mom. Anyway, it was nowhere near as long as Professor Dumbledore's." Next to Mrs. Weasley, Fred, George, and Charlie were all talking spiritedly about the World Cup. "It's going to be Ireland," said Charlie thickly, with a mouthful of potato. "They flattened Peru in the semifinals." "Bulgaria have Victor Crumb, though," said Fred. "Crumb's one decent player. Ireland has got 7, said Charlie shortly. "I wish England had got through, though. That's embarrassing, that was." What happened? Said Harry eagerly, regretting that he more than ever his isolation from the wizarding world when he stuck to Privet Drive. Harry was passionate about Quidditch. He had played as Seeker on the Gryffindor House Quidditch team ever since his first year at Hogwarts, and owned a Firebolt, one of the best racing brooms in the world. Went down to Transylvania, 391 to 10, Charlie said gloomily. Shocking performance. And Wales lost to Uganda, and Scotland were slaughtered by Luxembourg. Mr. Weasley conjured up candles to light the darkening garden before they had their pudding, homemade strawberry ice cream. And by the time they had finished, moths were fluttering low on the table, and warm air was perfumed with the smell of grass and honeysuckle. Harry was feeling quite well fed and at peace with the world as he watched several gnomes sprinting through the rose bushes, laughing madly as they were closely pursued by Crookshanks. Ron carefully looked up the table to check that the rest of his family was all busy talking. Then he said very quietly, "So have you heard from Sirius lately?" Hermione looked round, listening closely. "Yeah," said Harry softly. "Twice. He sounds okay. I wrote to him yesterday. He might be back here while I'm here." He suddenly remembered the reason he had written to Sirius, and for a moment was on the verge of telling Ron and Hermione about his scar hurting again, and about the dream that had awoken him. But he didn't want to worry them just now, when he himself felt so peaceful and happy. "Look at the time," said Mrs. Weasley suddenly, checking her wristwatch. "You really should be in bed, the whole lot of you. You'll be up at the crack of dawn to get to the cup. Harry, if you leave your school list out, I'll get your things for you tomorrow in Diagon Alley. I'm getting everyone else's. There might not be time after the World Cup. That match went on for 5 days last time. Wow!" "Hope it does this time," said Harry enthusiastically. "Well, I certainly don't," said Peter sanctimoniously. "I shudder at what state my in-tray would be if I was gone from work for 5 days. Yeah, someone might slip dragon dung into your cauldron again, eh, Percy?" "There was a sample of fertilizer. That was a sample of fertilizer from Norway," said Percy, going very red in the face. "It was nothing personal." "It was," Fred whispered to Harry as they got up from the table. "We sent it." Okay, that is the end of Chapter 5. The Weasleys, Harry, Hermione, and everybody else are going to bed. They're going to get ready for the World Quidditch Cup tomorrow in Chapter 6, and we're going to find out what happens there. Don't forget on our thread below this video to post your prediction about what you think is going to happen. Remember, right, I predict that, and then use evidence to explain because. Why do you think that's going to happen at the Quidditch World Cup? I'll see you guys tomorrow. Happy reading.